Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for attending the Data Security Discovery Cafe session. We have an hour and 15 minutes, which does include a Q&A. Just for everybody to notice, they'll have a standing mic when it comes to that portion of the session. Please feel free to come up and ask your questions. We're pleased to have a record turnout at the forum, which is fantastic. So I'm going to help try to keep us on time. We have a lot of activities for the day. For our session, the security of data is a fundamental requirement throughout healthcare. With unprecedented amounts of data being generated throughout medicine, there are new risks introduced every day, and more than ever, increased scale of potential breaches. We've assembled an impressive panel of top provider and industry security experts to discuss security implications in more detail. The moderator for today is John Pyhtila. A little bit about John. So we were lucky enough to have John join Partners Healthcare last year as the Chief Data and Analytics Officer. He's responsible for setting and executing the technical and strategic direction for Partners' data and analytics organization in concert with the overall business objectives for the system. Prior to Partners, John was the head of analytics at Cigna, where he led the advanced data analytics science team. Before Cigna, John spent considerable time at Verisk Health, where he led the enterprise analytics division, McKinsey & Company, as well as Hewlett-Packard and Motorola. He holds a bachelor's degree from Michigan State, a master's degree from Stanford, and a PhD in biomedical engineering from Duke University. It's my pleasure to introduce your moderator for this session, John Pyhtila.
Well, thank you. And welcome, everybody. Appreciate everybody coming here today and participating in the panel. So I want to give just a little bit of background to set the context, and then we'll open it up to some questions for our panel here. And so first off, when you think about data and what's going on as far as data security goes in this space, data breaches are becoming more and more common. Almost becomes a weekly basis that you hear of something big happening from a data breach perspective. If you think back, there are some massive data breaches over the last couple of years, whether it was more recently with Equifax, having a breach of over 140 million records as far as individual records. Prior to that, there was eBay, also in that 140 million range. And prior to that, there was the data breach of Yahoo, which was in the billions range. And so these things were almost becoming numb to them. But it's something that we've got to focus on, and we've got to continue to focus on increasing the security of our data. In the healthcare industry, there have also been some very large breaches in the past. 2015 was probably the record year as far as breaches go, with over 100 million records lost in just 3 breaches overall. And when you think about the healthcare industry, when you look at some of the trends as far as data breaches go, the cost of a data breach in the healthcare industry is almost twice as expensive at $380 per record lost to companies that have a data breach versus other industries where the cost is roughly $200. And additionally, when you look at the overall cost of data breaches in the healthcare industry, it's estimated that the total cost is in the range of $6 billion annually. That's a significant cost that really should be a motivation as far as our focus to be able to increase the security of our data. Furthermore, when you look at trends as far as data breaches go, you have increasing amount of time that it's taking to be able to even identify that a breach has happened. 300 days is the most recent statistic. And so while we look at 2017 and we say that the number of data breaches as far as the total number of records has decreased from that 2015 year, the overall amount of data, the overall amount of number of breaches has increased into the range of roughly 450. And we're still in that 300-day window, and so you've got to imagine that there's many data breaches that have occurred in 2017 that we still don't even know about. When you look at the mix of data breaches, it's now estimated that over 50% are due to malicious activity. So somebody wanting to come in and get access to the data and do something with that data to cause harm. And the attacks from those malicious actors are actually getting more complex. New instances where they've identified using machine learning to be able to not only conduct the attack, but also disguise the attack in a way that where it's much harder to be able to identify because it's mimicking the activities or the actions of a person. And so while historically I'd say it was a little bit easier to identify these malicious attacks because the activity that you saw looked very different than what a human would be doing, through application of machine learning, now all of a sudden these breaches are looking very similar to what you or I might be doing within our system, and it makes it much harder to identify. Furthermore, if you think about the overall industry, it's really becoming an AI arms race. And so you've got the malicious actors starting to use machine learning and other types of AI technology. On the same side, you've got companies such as ourselves trying to use AI and machine learning to be able to better protect our data. And so the question really is begged, who's going to win that arms race? We have a great panel today, extremely talented and with deep subject expertise in the area. To my right, first we have Krenzel, Chief Information Security Officer at IBM Watson Health. Second, we have Steve McHale, the Chairman of the Unify Project and formerly CEO of Exploris, and Jigar Kadakia, Partners Own Chief Information Security and Protection Officer. And so through the course of the next hour, we're going to pose some questions to the panel and get their take as far as this arms race that's going on from a data security perspective. And then we'll open up the floor to questions out in the audience, and we want to hear your questions, what's top of mind from you. And so please prepare as you're listening to the conversations to make sure that you bring forth your questions. And with that, let me turn it over to each of our panelists to first give a bit more of a detailed introduction, but then also give their thoughts as far as where they think the whole data security industry is going in the coming years. So Carl, if you could start, please.
Wow, that's quite a starting point. Well, thanks for setting the stage so well. And so Carl Krenzel, and as was mentioned, Chief Security Officer for IBM. That's my current role. My activity within the company, however, is defined by two different functions I have. I'm a Vice President at IBM, which means I run a large portion of the business execution. But the other hat I wear is a Distinguished Engineer at IBM, which means I'm a geek. And primarily, it's an executive geek that IBM has distinguished engineers who are sort of the CTOs for various areas of a business. I was assigned to Watson as the fourth executive in 2011 to figure out how to commercialize our artificial intelligence project at that time. So I have the good, bad, and ugly experience of trying to incubate the first AI that actually was doing something useful into the marketplace. And then, at the same time, I became the Chief Security Officer for our artificial intelligence projects. This was because of my background in cloud and security in the 10 years prior of IBM getting started. I have been a small company startup person, got acquired into IBM through that path, and have been doing innovation and incubation since then. I will say that relative to the current topic, and the reason why I'm a Chief Security Officer for IBM is actually quite tied together. I could be, and maybe sometimes should be, starting the next big project for the company, because that's what I do. I made it very clear to our senior leadership that I need to stay exactly where I am, because the next big project for the company is making sure that artificial intelligence and security and healthcare dovetail together. This is where the battlefront lies. This is where the innovations are going to happen in the intersection between social, cloud, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and blockchain. This flashpoint of those 5 things together will make what happened when the internet started look like a flash bomb, and this will look like a very large, let's just say a gasoline truck explosion, very different scale. And we're about to all go through that together. Now, I'm convinced there are ways to navigate it, but we all have to think and approach things quite differently to take advantage of it, so we are the, shall I say, the Netflix of this transformation instead of the blockbuster video. So that's what I will bring to this discussion, but I'll save it for later. Go ahead. Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve McHale. I was introduced as I was CEO and one of the co-founders of Exploris. I actually had a parallel life that ran along with that. I worked closely with my older brother, John, McHale in Austin. And so we've launched a number of companies together. He was also on the board of Explorus, but security was an area of interest of ours and portfolio development. So we had a group called Genesis Inventions, and we started with, our first was the first IPS system, so it was called Tipping Point. So it was full inline wire speed intrusion prevention system, so versus detection, where you find out the building's on fire by the time they're in. This was prevention, knocking down hostile attacks and all that. It was acquired by 3Com, hence acquired by Hewlett-Packard. So it was called Tipping Point. So we learned a lot about general security, IP security, things of that nature that were more perimeter-based, but also inside. So as we know, a lot of attacks happen, most attack from within. So by either phishing exercises, things of that nature. So the next portfolio company we launched was Security Test. So it was called Breaking Point. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but Breaking Point was a very interesting portfolio company for ours because we built it really to test NOS. So we sold a lot of them to Juniper and Cisco and those kinds of router and switch manufacturers for them to test vulnerabilities. So one of the programs would be heavy DOS, get the NOS in a weakened state, find vulnerabilities, seep in attacks, and then try to help them identify again where they could enhance the security on a network operating system. That was always interesting too, because I remember sitting next to John Chambers a few years ago, and he was talking about the Huawei cloning of the NOS in 15 days when they drop a router into China. So as much as they would try to button all that up, there was still abilities to get in and get in at the lowest levels of the operating systems and basically unpack them. So, in the test business, the one interesting story about that I've always been fascinated about, although I've never gotten all the details from my brother, which is we were shipping a lot of these blades to a distributor. This was Breaking Point, our security test equipment. And then there was a time for an upgrade, and finally we figured out that they were being bought by the NSA. So we got to get this story from the NSA that they would use our blades for, which was they'd wait for the attacks to come in, they'd use our gear to record them at wire speed, and then they would basically figure out how to spoof them back in, like as a return back to the system, crawl inside the attacking systems, many of them were China at the time, and then they would record all the data that was on those servers, bring it back, and then they'd kick on low level to wipe the servers out. So they would use them as cyber weapons. And so the reason I share that example is because as Carl just mentioned, you got to play both sides of the ball. And so what's happening is this convergence between AI. AI can go on the offensive, AI can be on the defensive. And the question is, it's going to be an arms race, like you said. And if, we have this flashpoint, when you converge that with then blockchain, for example, is a great example. I agree, blockchain is going to, play a major part, hopefully in the way of prevention versus on the attack side. But this is the experience we've had. It would benefited Explorus, which was a big data analytics company, because we brought in our chops on security from day one. So even before we had the blessing of being part of IBM and their security expertise, we were using our Breaking Point and Tipping Point type skills to put the perimeter up around our data. And when we called our data, that really today it was a honeypot, right? That's what people want to go after. So we used that, buttoned it up, knock on wood, we prevented any breaches at all through the history of Explorus. So the combination of understanding and learning big data and then using security to protect it has served us well and served me well in my career. Turn over to Jigar from here.
Thanks. So there are seats up here. People need some seats that are standing at the door. So broadly speaking, I think there's two things. I'm the guy that most people dislike because I'm changing the way you do your work, right? So every day in security, there's a new thing that has to be done, and my job is to make that thing happen. So what does that do? It impacts your job. Many of your folks and many of your teams are impacted by the changes we make. Either we make things more restrictive, less flexible, and those type of things, which impact the way you work, which impacts, your work overall. And so making those decisions on a risk-based value proposition is critical, and trying to balance it. So when you think about AI, there's a lot of noise around AI when you think AI and security. So you have to find the key pieces that you feel are most vulnerable and protect those. There's going to be risk associated with it, whether it's risk going out or risk coming in or the hackers leveraging the technology overall. But you're going to have to make some decisions, and we have to be flexible enough to make the decisions with you, work in conjunction with you, so that we can do not only secure whatever you're doing and secure AI for the organization, but also for the rest of the population as well.
Great. Well,
Good
thank
job.
you all. And so let's start out just by thinking about the risks that are posed here. And maybe Carl, I'll direct this to you first. As you look out in the landscape and you think about the malicious actors being able to start to use AI to generate attacks, how do you think the threat is going to evolve and change that we're going to be facing from our data security perspective as AI becomes more prevalent with malicious actors?
So the changes that I think we all have to take into account when it comes to AI and the current threat landscape. First, park AI for a second. The threat landscape of the last 10 years has been quadratic, if not exponential. You described a few of the breaches. Within that context, even if you don't account for AI, you have to have a readiness posture of assuming at all times that you've already been breached, you just don't know it.
Right.
That has to be our readiness posture. That's the 21st century. So if you start from that perspective and ask yourself, if you assume you're already breached, what do you do about it? Then you actually approach things differently. 20th century architecture, security architecture is dependent upon a great firewall. Think of I use the analogy of blowing up a balloon. It's nice and tough on the outside and it's empty on the inside. The moment you pop it, you've got nothing. That's old style security. Nowadays, security strategies have to be honeycomb, they have to be reactive, they have to have decoy placement, different techniques to mitigate that assumed risk that you've already been breached. So you start with that, then what does AI bring to the table? Though it does bring some great projects and capabilities for helping mitigate the risk of assuming you're already breached. 3 years ago, I started a Skunkworks project that is now IBM's Watson for Cybersecurity project. There are ways to bring AI to these risks. But the threat of AI as an actor in the system needs to be considered as an insider threat type of attack. Because an AI will be acting on behalf of or helping somebody, be augmented intelligence. Somebody will be using a smart Watson or a smart Siri or something along the lines of an AI in their process. And what that AI is taught, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to follow the data. One of my mantras to the organizations that I work with is follow the data and lock the way out. Because the risks are the wrong data goes into the AI and it's I call it a poison pill sometimes. Then the AI has incorrect behavior, which could lead to a malicious, intended or unintended act. Let's say, so the risk that AI produces is if you don't pay attention to what you train the AI with, that's called content curation, you could accidentally let it be given the wrong inputs that produces a poisonous bias. So that's a new risk. The other remaining risk that I would say we all have to pay attention to is managing the toxicity of data when it's in the wild. You mentioned $300.
Yeah, 320.
320, depending on the study, $320 per patient record in the wild that's been breached. Why is that? So one of the things that we collectively as an industry need to do is figure out why is data toxic? when the privacy is breached, and work to remove the toxicity with regulators, with privacy specialists, with our own patient and healthcare communities. So when you assume you've been breached, you pay attention to the toxicity and cleanup, and how can you mitigate toxicity. So those are the new risks around us. Are the AIs will create greater exposure of that toxicity, but they also are not in themselves the threat. The threat is there's so many different ways to be hacked, and we've already been hacked pre-AI. The industry, all those people who had Yahoo accounts that were hacked, think of how many of them are in healthcare, and their 3 secret questions and their password on Yahoo was hacked. Now, where else do they use those 3 secret questions? In the logins that you've given them? Probably. So how do we detoxify the data is as important as anything else.
Anything to add?
You know, go ahead.
Oh, no. So I think Carl made a point. So we have to be threat hunters now. We can't be reactive and wait, right? So the technology, AI, analytics, et cetera, we have to be in the formation of threat hunters and seek out the threats that impact our environments on an ongoing basis, so advance. Typically in the security world and even in technology, we rely on signature-based security solutions. So, you know, the Microsoft endpoint solution, et cetera. So we have to move into advanced threat type solutions, which aren't signature-based, and look at you know, the data within the system itself. So manipulations of the data. So when we think about AI technology and its learning ability, being able to leverage the learning ability as a defense mechanism to hunt out the threats is going to be critical for the future. And I'd say that's probably 2 years, 3 years out from happening.
Yeah, no, great. I think about how we might consider some of the major changes that are happening in technology that are coming to the forefront and available. And when we look at, you know, we started with, you know, hardware encryption. So we started encrypting drives and stuff. So we started doing physical encryption, and, you know, then, you know, ransomware shows up and says, oh, let's re-encrypt. Let's button that up and then ask for, you know, X Bitcoin to get our currents, to get paid for the holding your data hostage, and it's been relatively effective. And then you think about some of the things that have really come, that are available now, like blockchain. As an example, where we start to think, how do we split it up? Because these really large, as I called even the Explorer stage, was the honeypot, right? People want to go after those giant proprietary stored data sets that basically have got you know, one target. You come straight in. So as you think about, even we talked about how do you make the data less attractive? Well, you take out some of the PHI or the data that would be meaningful, put it on a blockchain, have it, you know, distributed in a blockchain with you know, SHA-256 encryption on it, and you're sitting there with this. Okay, let's say they hit the major data store, but all the important data is off chain, or off on a chain, on a blockchain. You're like, they're not going to get much out of it. There's a lot of ways you can prepare, as you said, and I think, and then at the same time using AI to go on the. I love that idea where you're basically on the offensive. You're really out hunting.
What do you propose for the consumer, right? So
Yeah,
we
that's
talk
a good one.
about
Great question.
blockchain and those type of technologies, but from a consumer perspective, it's hard to consume.
It is.
And the usability will not be as prevalent as it is today.
It'll be clunky.
How do you manage the user interaction? Because if you look at the way consumers are going, everything is going to be available to them on their phone,
Right.
right? Mm-hmm. Their medical records, their banking, everything they do will be on their phone. And the culture shift, especially with the millennials or whatever you want to call them, the college kids of today, they're not going to be the traditional people in the way we reach them today. How do we consumerize this stuff so it's useful for them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's very exciting to think about, what that looks like. It's almost like the decentralization of the internet, right? Which is what we're really getting to, which is what's the perimeter look like, and how do you start to move away from proprietary models and that have really kind of taken all the air out of the room as it relates to what the internet was initially created for. But that personal device sitting there right in my phone, I couldn't sit here and tell you I have all those kinds of answers, but I think there's an enormous movement around that, and consumers getting control of their data back, so that if it is really a truly federated data model that's secure, I can't tell you blockchain's the elixir, but it looks pretty promising that you could start to move data into a perimeter, have some of it off-chain, have some of it on-chain. That would be really the areas that would have great vulnerabilities and make something out of that. So we actually have another project we're working on that's related to socioeconomic change, and we're working on those technologies to implement those kinds of things. But we're not moving all the way to consumer yet. But that's the right question.
Yeah,
It's a great
Carl,
question.
I'd love to hear your view on that
Yeah.
also, considering the amount of data that IBM Watson has. How are you leveraging blockchain or other technologies to be able to help protect, but also then still federate data for consumers?
And empower the consumers. In my area of responsibility, we have between what we brought in with the wonderful Explorus acquisition, as well as Truven and others, we have 300 million patient lives of data. I don't sleep well at night. What we are doing in terms of the patient and end user side of this is we are actively investing in both research and pilots with partners, big companies ranging from Medtronic to Teva Pharmaceuticals, lots of our big partners. In many cases, we have partnership with you at Partners Healthcare. What we're doing is bringing patient consent management scenarios into the consumer experience, because there's absolutely no reason why a patient or an individual couldn't take up a mobile application and say, yes, I want this company, and no, I don't want that company to know my blood pressure, that type of stuff. Now, making it usable, that's a journey. But we're not the only ones trying to do this with that blockchain technology. So what's blockchain useful for? It's a technology in search of a problem when you talk about it on its own. But the problems are actually very discrete and very clear to go after. And blockchain is the well-suited technology. That's the enablement part. But then I go back to the toxicity of the data. If you look at the millennials and then the generation after them, which I call the centennials, actually not just me, a lot of people call them the centennials. They're the ones in college right now or just out of college. And we often talk about how people who are from those generations care less about whether or not their private information is made visible. Well, why don't they care? When you ask them, when you actually do studies, what do they worry about? Why don't they worry about their private information being online? They are not actually afraid of being denied coverage based upon prior experiences. If they're not worried about the things that maybe people with more years have had experience to worry about. Now, are they right to not worry about that? Are they sort of head in the sand? Or are things changing? Can we actually make it non-toxic for a non-toxic consequence for your entire patient history to be on the web? What are the negative consequences if that happened? If everybody knew your patient history, all your private data, there's fraud, there's discrimination. Go through the list of those things, and what can we do as an industry to mitigate the actual negative? If somebody knows everything about me, but they can't pretend to be me, does it matter? Now, some people, of course, everyone deserves their privacy, but detoxifying the consequence is important. So back to why does blockchain matter within the pilots we are doing in the industry? It's a way to give control to that data. With that control, you can remove some of the toxicity by using your control. And then the other end of it is working with FDA and other policymakers around if that information is stolen, how much harm can it really do? And how can we mitigate the harm?
I think you raised some great points there, the whole panel does. And you opened up an interesting perspective around policy and regulation. And it's often said that regulation will trail technology by multiple years. And so, Jigar, maybe I'll throw this to you, is get your perspective as far as where are we at from a regulation perspective as we think about the quickly evolving space as far as data security goes. Is it lagging? And if so, what should we be trying to do from a regulation perspective to be able to help improve this space?
So it's definitely lagging. I think there's a bit of give and take between the industry and the regulators. I think we're probably 5 to 8 years behind. So within compliance and within regulations, there's always a piece of paper, and if I do X, Y, Z, you're good. But it's always a point in time, and it's never ongoing or reactive. So you may have a good security program in place or a policy in place today, but tomorrow you get breached, so you have to redo your entire policy or program itself, and the regulators are never going to be able to catch up with that. So the recommendation, I think, or the policymakers should come up with a broad framework with some very specifics that most people can comply with. So most organizations, if they haven't, they should be on two-factor authentication, out-of-band, not secret questions as Carl had mentioned before, but out-of-band two-factor authentication, right? So it's clearly consumer-friendly. Users are used to it now. It provides a layer of identity proofing for the individual, and it's very hard to hack into because you have to have the form factor associated with it. Make that a requirement for all, then everybody would be doing it, and that would be something that I think would drastically change the evolution of technology and security. We have critical infrastructure in the US. Why not have a critical infrastructure related to the network for medical technology and medical? So all the hospitals around the nation and all the healthcare folks around the nation would join the critical federal supported protected network that we would all use, and it would only be for medical traffic and hospital traffic. That way we can protect ourselves broadly as a set of organizations against the hackers, because they all leverage the Verizon LAN into your organization and then hack into it. But if they have to penetrate a government supported infrastructure that we all pay into, then it's going to be harder to break into. So those big type of things are where we're going to have to go for regulation and the federal government really to kind of catch up and help us in this battle.
Thank you, Jigar. Steve, see a lot of head nods from you. Anything to add?
I really just know kind of the standards, as Jigar mentioned, which is, are you NIST standard? Are you, if you want to go all the way from a data center, are you FedRAMP certified, which now we see, I think Google's got to that level as they caught up, and Amazon's solutions are FedRAMP. And those are, the standards that exist today in a point of time. But I agree, they need to be not just continuous, but contiguous. So we need to have that kind of framework that gets into place that says it has to be constantly be growing, enhancing, upgrading, and learning as a standard to try to close the gap between, what's on the front line coming in and, your ability to, sustain yourself. So I think policy needs to change with that.
And Carl, maybe I'll ask you to comment on more of an international perspective. So you've got Europe,
You were
you've got
reading my
Asia.
mind.
A lot of different policies going on, regulations changing all over the place. How are you keeping up, and where do you think we need to go from an international perspective?
Well, I was thinking as you were, right before you said that, GDPR is the one that's all on our doorstep. And boy, are we doing a lot of things to adapt for GDPR. It's a regulatory expression of patient control. So we're not just doing blockchain for the fun of it. We have real needs to put patients in control. So there's an example of a very large industry regulatory impact this year. And beyond that, with as we watched poor Mark Zuckerberg be grilled by Congress, there is a lot of speculation that that particular conversation will bring a GDPR class of regulation here to the US. So we're all trying to adapt to GDPR, and in some respects, I know Partners works primarily in the US, but is working internationally, starting to do that. And so none of us get to say, GDPR, that's the problem out there.
Yeah.
Now, GDPR is one piece of the puzzle, but then there's also, we, as IBM, we have to take our technologies to a lot of countries. So my team is working on how do we bring our Watson for Oncology into China. In fact, we currently have Watson for Oncology used by McHale in China. In that particular case, an oncologist spends 5 minutes with 100 patients in a day. That's the relationship that they have between oncologists and cancer patients. So there's a scenario where a trained AI that basically bottles the expertise of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center experts into a tablet that can be used by that doctor is a very powerful AI scenario. But then there's a lot of policy and regulatory considerations that we have to look at when we're going into that marketplace with that healthcare solution. I'll peel it back to one here on the ground here in the US that also sets a bar that then relates to how we go to market elsewhere, whether it's Australia or China. FDA regulations around medical devices, GXP. Right now, IBM finally got it out there, released it earlier this year. We're the only company that's actually gone to market with a GXP-enabled, HIPAA-enabled cloud. I got to tell you, that's hard because it's not just security, it's quality. Yet on the other hand, can you ever say quality without security? Because a lot of the negative security consequences of being hacked is somebody takes your cloud down, or somebody damages the outcome of your medical device. So when we're looking at global policies and making sure that they are ready for this 21st century, it is medical requirements on devices as much as privacy and data security.
So excellent points, and I think I'd like to investigate one thread that you had in there in a little bit more detail before opening it up to the audience, and that is we've been talking mostly about data security right now. I'd like to shift the conversation to now system security. And so the easy to understand example is self-driving cars. And so if you have a self-driving car and that car gets hacked, there's real potential to be able to do very malicious outcomes to that individual, right? So apply that to the healthcare space, and as we're starting to automate through AI different systems, whether it's diagnosis systems, or you mentioned Internet of Things earlier on, and you've got systems that are on your body doing something, and they're wired into the internet. There's potential there, right? So how does that shift the conversation from a security perspective? And so Steve, maybe I'll open it up to you to get your initial thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's dramatic. I mean, that's probably what we're dealing with today. Is we're just in the piker stage, right? I mean, what's coming when we go IoT and you think about, insulin pumps connected, all those kinds of things. I mean, pacemakers, devices even in the OR, things that become much more intelligent. There's so much more at stake. I mean, there just is. And I was looking at there was a SnapR attack that was brilliant. I mean, the way that they had really, AI had faked out consumers, took it in through Twitter. They've come in through different ways, but they've proven that, you get connected devices and you get a point of human intervention where they have an opportunity to have any type of control over the flow. You could get a hold of anything. I mean, so I think that Intel's working on chips with security, built right in, but what happens if that has a nefarious attack, right? It's not like it's going to be an elixir to everything. So, where we're headed now, the counters to that's going to be federation and, very, very powerful crowdsourcing, I think, around understanding what's happening in our environment so that we've got a lot of positive, would say, watchdogs, where there's the technology around and things like that. So we're going to have to really rethink the centralized world that we've lived in, where we protect certain assets and try to perimeter them, and we have to think that that's just not going to be possible, as everybody said earlier. I think we've got an extreme shift in our society and in technology, which is hitting us really midstream. And it's not like we're all thinking, I like to put my head on my pillow at night thinking, oh, it's really far off, but it's not. I mean, driverless cars are coming, and we think about, it was just, I met with a politician in Ohio, not one of my favorite things to do, but as we got together, he reminded me, he said, what the #1 job is in Ohio, the job category. And I said, no, I don't know what that is. He goes, driver. And it's a driver, whether it's trucks, whether it's Uber, whatever it is, whether it's a gig economy type employee. And we think about those things. And as we really look at our society moving towards that, where our data, we're going to a knowledge-based society. We're going to be the first there between us and China. We're moving very quickly. Your assets and who you are is your data and your information. And so as we're moving to those kinds of things, and the threat that means to the well-being of humans is huge. So I know I just went pretty esoteric there, but it's coming. It's on the horizon. It's coming at us. So what we're dealing with today is just the opening salvos.
Yeah. So the biomed devices, I think, is a huge problem in the hospital space. I think it's many of our devices are already connected and fully talking to one another in the environment. I think the big issue is probably 5 years away is the rotation of the old devices, right? So many devices are 10, 15, 20 years old. They're running on Windows 98 or whatever.
Yeah.
Operating systems, and they're still viable, devices in our institutions. And so rotating through those devices, the newer devices are becoming more connected, which poses a different set of issues versus the old devices overall. So this is where the FDA has to really provide guidance. There's been a number of working groups with the FDA for years to try to get them to pin some concrete guidance. It hasn't happened yet. They're opening up to, commentary till the end of May for legacy devices. So they finally have figured out that we need to focus on legacy devices in one manner and the new devices in a different manner. And I think that's going to be a pivotal thing if they can get the regulations out and approved to really change the biomedical device space overall.
Yeah.
Carl, anything to add?
Well, it ties back to the GXP requirements from the FDA, which paralyzes teams over and over again. They say, Carl, we can't upgrade that device because we went through all the validation and verification testing. We can't reset the clock for 10 months of testing. And now you will encounter, if you deal with medical devices, you'll encounter teams that take that interpretation of the guidance. Policy and regulations are there are very explicit aspects of them, and then there are a whole host of precedential and interpretive people take interpretations and don't realize that they're carrying an interpretation forward that was given to them over and over again, when the interpretation can be shifted. So there are many cases when teams have said to me, I can't get rid of that Windows 2008 server. I say, well, why? And we peel down to the interpretation. Somebody told them they can't because of an interpretation of the policy, not the actual policy. So when you take it back to the company's level of risk posture, you always have to look very carefully at how you're interpreting regulation. Because you could be interpreting regulation in a way that, from one legal perspective is a risk-averse interpretation. But if you look at from the business impact perspective of taking that knee-jerk, no, I can't remove that because of the risk it would create to the business, the other side, you're creating a lot more risk by not updating it. So do not get locked into, I can't because compliance team told me I can't. Go sit with the compliance team and talk about how you can. Oftentimes people demonize the compliance team, put them in a corner and say, they're the office of can't. In 21st century, you have to change that. They're the office of can. They're your partner through these hard situations. Now, one other piece of well, I'd love to go on that tangent, but I won't. Looking at the time.
Maybe it'll come up from the audience, right? So would love to hear from the audience if you don't mind stepping to the mic and ask the panel your questions.
Hi, I was quite curious to hear what seemed to be the general enthusiasm for the federal critical support network for moving hospital systems onto to help with security and all of that. And I'd love to hear you address that issue again in the light of the federal government's well and repeatedly demonstrated complete incompetence at securing itself. Let's start with the massive NSA breach, Edward Snowden, move on to the Army breach with Bradley Chelsea Manning, and then the White House Office of Personnel Management, in which millions of the detailed security clearance type profiles of people, including fingerprints and everything else, were hacked. So the same bunch of people are supposed to improve hospital and medical security. I'd just love to hear your reaction in the light of those facts about the federal government's track record of real-world security.
So I'm the one who brought it up, right? And so I would just say, when you think about hospital organizations across the country, the hospital in the little town in Iowa does not have any security support. They probably have one IT guy to keep the systems running. Their exposure to the chain of hospital systems across the U.S. is just as important as our responsibility here. So the goal here is there's always this view of the poverty line. So there's certain organizations that can pay for security and IT support, and those above it do a good job and have some semblance of a security program. The ones below the poverty line, which there's tens of thousands, we got to support those guys, right? They're part of the entire ecosystem, and by providing a secure network for them, reduces the risk to us and partners here in Mass General and the Brigham here in Boston, and to any big hospital organization across the U.S. So we got to help the below poverty folks, and this is one way to kind of help them. I agree that the government isn't the best at it. I think part of that is just government, but they'll do more than what the little folks can do right now, which is nothing.
Yeah, and the government could help establish policy, but the health systems can come together and figure the network out and what they want to do. They currently have the time, treasure, and talent to do it. And so I couldn't agree more. You need to lift up those that really don't have the capacity and bring them into a network that's secure. It makes a lot of sense.
I would also add that let's not confuse a network with the top to bottom of security.
Yeah.
So there, as you all know, there's many layers and concentric rings of security, honeycombs and stuff like that.
Yep.
So I value having a more secure network. IBM itself is not saying you all should get onto that particular network per se. What we are saying is take a holistic security strategy that starts with the assumption that your network is already porous and hacked and run by incompetent people. It may be governed or not. So if it is, what do you do? Well, you do encryption, yes. That should be the bottom line all the time, is you always have encryption. That's sort of anti. Over the wire and also the data. But then for the ransomware threats and such, you need to really have usable backups. How do you know you have usable backups? You do emulations of breach scenarios.
Right.
You hack yourself. And now the small provider offices, they are not going to be able to hack themselves. They're too busy. So larger organizations in the community can offer a variety of services to them. Would you like to be hacked today? And come into a friendly hack. I mean, there's ways that we as a community can add to the layers. But absolutely, the network should be as good as it can be, but it's not the thing you trust.
Right. And looking for example, if you provide infrastructure to those providers or systems that could use your help, and you could even provide some of the tools and monitoring things that look for data anomalies of reading and writing that says, hey, this thing is under attack. You can spot it on the way in. So you're doing some monitoring that is not as traditional, which is like it looks like there's, heavy duty things while you're approaching the attacks. You can simulate those things. And yeah, there's a way to bring this together. It doesn't have to be all done by government policy.
No,
It just
agreed.
doesn't. Yeah.
Great question. Next.
Very good.
Thank all you gentlemen for sharing your expertise. My name's Bill Godeke. I'm the principal data architect at Messina, and I am particularly grateful to meet my new leadership. So thanks for coming. I would like to shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about, I think, of security as being a triumvirate of secrecy, integrity, and the ultimate bugaboo, access. So one who is dedicated towards research, I wonder what your thoughts are. This gentleman mentioned federations, which I don't hear about much anymore these days.
Well, you guys invented I2B2.
Well-
that was one of the first federated models. I thought it was brilliant. Yeah.
Some of the things I'm responsible for are packaging large databases for, I'll admit, sale to external entities, which means some sort of de-identification. We have redacting, we have the natural language processing, extraction of medical data out of that so that we lose the identity issues. There are multi-institutional registries. I'd like to see distributed data governance there, which brought me to the federated notion. And just the sharing of data is an honest broker within our internal researchers. And so I wonder what you all have to say about what the state of the art is regarding access. Thank you.
Well, can I ask a quick question? So when you talk about the federated de-identified, is it safe harbor? Because when you
I'm
dropped an
thinking about in
NLP.
commons.
What's that?
In
Database
commons.
commons.
Okay, all right. Go ahead if you.
Jigger?
This is more your area of expertise, John. But from an access perspective, this is an area that we are challenged with because the value set of the data is so broad, and providing not just access to the data, but understanding what the data is going to be used for, and managing that process. So if you think about the life cycle of data from acquisition to storage to usability to destruction, it's usually the destruction piece or the usability piece that we kind of lose track, and that's how it proliferates within our environments, right? So managing the process and limiting the number of people that have access to the data and having a good governance structure around it is kind of our overall approach. I think we've been quite successful with it. We have targeted data sets for certain data uses that we have very well managed, and we try to guide people into those kind of data sets.
Yeah, from my perspective, access in any form, centralized or federated, the critical factor is that the users of the content know that every single step of their use is logged in a tamper-proof location like our QRadar stores. There is a contract of integrity between the user of such data and that is enforced by the data controller, the
He's using
entity.
GDPR terms now.
Sorry, they're drilled into me.
They slipped into your body, so crawled in.
They crawled in. Yes, there's AI. But an AI virus got into my head.
Right.
But data controllers are basically, they're those of us who own the data. And the people who own the data when we as individuals are given access, we have a responsibility that comes with that access. And at that point, if you also know that all of your steps are logged, it's both a safety net in case you did something inadvertent, then it's auditably findable. It's also a deterrent to misuse. Now, neither of those is a substitute for proper education to those people about what they should know. Many times developers ask me for a deviation approval. Can they have access to the PHI production system so that they can fix bugs? I say, sure, after you go through these 5 courses. What? Like, well, okay, or you can have an hour with me where you explain, I throw questions at you and you prove to me you know what you're doing when it comes to the safety of the data. One last thing I would say is relative to more advanced protection mechanisms. I know, like, it sounds like I'm harping on blockchain, but there will be increasingly more encryption-based use only as long as you need it. And then the encryption key will expire, and then you no longer need it, and you then no longer have it sitting around, maybe on a file, a hard drive you shouldn't have put it on in the first place, but it's no longer accessible by you or anyone else because your encryption key, your key for that sub-data chunk is gone.
Thank you.
I have a question for Carl, and it's maybe a bit myopic, but one of personal curiosity. So specific to Watson and the data inputs into Watson. So you mentioned 300 million patient records. So I've always wondered, where does all this stuff come from? And what are the challenges of making sure that when you federate data like that together from what I assume is a lot of disparate places, that it comes to you in a way that has no malicious intent that comes with it?
It's the magic of Watson.
Yeah, so when I say 300 million patient lives, one important thing is it's not all sitting in one place, right? You don't put all the gold in one basket for somebody to steal. And in fact, we have a lot of baskets sitting around in my cloud that are fool's gold with traps and alarm bells. Last time I brought in some friendly hackers to hack my cloud, they told me they found a data source, and I said, yeah, I know you found it. It's a fake one. Thank you. So you have to have that kind of approach. But when it comes to your specific question around the provenance of the data, when we started the Watson Health Business Unit as a separate business unit in 2016, we had been doing Watson for Oncology since 2012 as a pilot, but as we built more of the Watson business, we took the health portion and spun it off as its own business unit, did the Explorers, Truven, Pyhtila, and Merge acquisitions to really get ourselves immersed in the healthcare and life sciences businesses. The moment we did that, we formed a data governance board because we realized whether it's GDPR or other scenarios, provenance and life cycle of the data was an absolute critical responsibility. And more importantly, as you'll hear oftentimes when Ginny, our CEO, is talking in public, she always emphasizes, in the world of AI, our stance is the data is yours, not ours. It is never ours. It is always yours. And that's the competitive advantage in the world of augmented intelligence, artificial intelligence. So the provenance of the data is managed through very rigorous tracking of its transforms. Where did we get it? What rights do we have to it? How long do those rights exist? What are the secondary use rights? And this is a massive overlay on top of all our data store. I got to tell you, it's a real pain. And now you may wonder, now you may have a hint as to why I like the idea of blockchain so much.
Yeah.
Because it's finally a plumbing that is well designed for the data transforms as data inflects from one point to the next, to the next, to the next, and all the usage. If I, way upstream, am told by some source that I no longer have the rights, they're revoking my rights to that patient data set, today it's a real pain to chase it down. I can manually. Tomorrow, when we've got the blockchain plumbing in place, it'll be a matter of just turning off a certain set of encryption keys.
Yeah, it's pretty. I think this is such an important topic. I think we called it stewardship, our stewardship of the data at Explorers, and you know, I reckon back to when we started Explorers, we had another topic came up about de-identification, right? So we worked with a professor out of Vanderbilt to statistically de-identify assets and data, but more importantly, we worked with a legal team out of Phoenix that this one lawyer, Kristen Rosati, led the rulemaking on the Hill in DC of the volunteer attorneys that did the rulemaking for HIPAA high-tech and for the, you know, the data governance. And so we worked with her. So we took it beyond the fear of wearing orange jumpsuits or anything like that.
Yeah.
We were great stewards of the source of the data, what were the usage rights of the data, making sure that nothing nefarious would happen with that data, and most importantly, recognizing our responsibility that, like, this is humans, this is people's data, our data's in there, right? And so, you know, we always treat it like our data. It's a really important subject, it really is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Next question.
Sure. I just had a question about what are qualitatively different sorts of attacks that we have to worry about now that we have AI? I mean, I don't worry so much about the 300 million records. I worry about things like, you know, what if there was a good biomarker for dementia and someone could insert this in and you could get a patient right when the dementia was starting and then target them for, you know, fraud or other sorts of things. So if you had an algorithm in the background that was sort of, you know, scanning things, and you'd just be getting a few patients out of here and there, it might be much harder to pick up that there's been an attack or a breach. But, you know, I don't think I'm professionally paranoid in the way that all you guys are. So I'm sort of curious, like, what's like a real thing that we need to be concerned about now that we have these deep learning, all these pattern recognition things that are going over these different patient records. What are the sort of things, new things that we need to be paranoid about?
Well, so the things to be paranoid about that I would suggest from my experience relative to AI as a threat is that it is able to, in the hands of a bad actor, it will look for certain patterns, and our headquarters in Binney Street here in Cambridge has both Watson Health as the headquarters and our security group as a headquarters. And the third floor of Binney Street has this marvelous experience called the Cyber Range. It's like one of those rooms that you're locked into and you have to figure your way out, but you're the company experiencing what it's like to be hacked. And we were saying Internet of Things earlier, we talk about the new devices, but practically every elevator is already hackable. So when you have a hack event, the hackers are trying to take control, steal things, and put you in a ransom situation. So so I encourage you, if you ever have an opportunity to go there and experience what it's like to, I don't know, testify in front of Congress. It's an entire immersion experience. You got to try it. But what we are finding is, as we are exploring what the dark web actors do and the tools they use are, it's an extra economy. They just sell on the dark web these utilities for easily doing a Hail Mary attack on Jigar's entire network. Yep. These new AI, these new tools, they're trying to embed AI. They are embedding AI into these things. So what are these things looking for? They're looking for how to steal and crack LDAP password stores, and they're looking for how to do SQL injection attacks. Those are the two hot properties. There are some other vectors they like to use. So the AI that's interesting, that we're working, how do we counteract that with our own security threat modeling, with X-Force threat modeling. We put some AI into it and announced it just recently at the RSA conference, as well as AI into our resilient tool set for both incident response and threat modeling to counteract what the hackers are doing, because what they're doing is trying to have a smarter attack into SQL injection to pull out the more vulnerable targets. And the more vulnerable targets may be the blackmailable patients.
So I think your question is a little bit more fundamental, right? So use cases on large data sets, such as the one you described, I would argue we haven't fully complemented in the security space. So I think those use cases, whether you're sending the data to IBM or whether you're using it internally, those are use cases that insiders could easily exploit, all right? And with some level of skill, they could run whatever program on that data set, and they could pull out those 5 patients one time, right? And I think no one would be able to see that, and those are the type of use cases that we in security are going to have to start to think about. We've always been concerned about protecting the all, right, the whole. We need to start thinking about the next step and what are those types of use cases. What can be done on a certain set of data sets that could be harmful to a patient? And that's the thing. I don't think I'm not contemplating those right now.
Great. Next question, please.
Before we go into that next question, I just want to say one thing that we have been piloting in the Explorers data set that Steve brought to us is I've got a few radioactive bombs, as I call them, in that data set that aren't real people, but they look like really attractive things to steal. So there is a lot of analysis of how do we detect when somebody's trying to compromise a data set because they're using it for a nefarious purpose. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sure, no worries. So actually, so recent data from the Center of Global Enterprise cites that over 80% of information breaches are actually in reference to third-party actors, so actually not malicious, so people that are in your supply chain. So what are you all doing specifically internally to react to third-party suppliers, third-party actors in your supply chain, especially as the industry moves now to FHIR, so fast healthcare interoperability, consumer-facing EHRs a la Apple, and then your third-party developer ecosystems?
You want me to start? I've got a lot to say.
I have a lot to say too. Go ahead.
I'm going to watch.
Thank you for that, that softball. Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. The supply chain issue is smack in the middle of why I'm in my current role. I've been reaching out to chief security officers in the healthcare community. And Jigar hasn't yet I haven't twisted his arm yet, but I've got several of the other CISOs. You're next. To join in on basically a security reference architecture for this 21st century we're in. Now, why? Why do we need that? I mean, we've got plenty of reference architectures across the industry. This is about the supply chain issue. We're all independently doing audits and handing questionnaires to our suppliers as if it's still the 20th century. And these are outsourcing audits, outsourcing checklists, not cloud checklists. We, as an industry, are very backwards in how we view interaction with a supplier, whether it's a cloud supplier or a software supplier or hardware supplier, and we don't really think of ourselves as a supplier to somebody else. So when we receive a questionnaire from the next person down the chain, we look at it and say, we can't fill this in. Or, no, that's not how we do business. So in general, we have a lot of friction in the system that comes from us not having a common governance of requirements across one company to the next, to the next, to the next. In this particular flashpoint, as I described it earlier, with also the threat conditions in place, the CISOs and the security organizations can no longer afford to be inward focused only. In 2008, when cloud became a very hot topic for the industry, the CIO's role changed, and they had to start looking across the value chain and instead of just internally. That's what's happening right now to the CISO roles. That's why I'm reaching out to other CISOs, so that we can establish cleaner practices for chaining up our organizations. Instead of being the primary disabler for a supply chain, the CISOs and their teams have to be the primary enabler. That's a very different stance. Are we there? No. But we have we have to do this. If we don't do this, then we're going to continue conjoining companies in a supply chain poorly, and the fractures in those joins is where the most damage can be done.
So I think there's two things that you mentioned. So the number of supplier incidents. So us doing business with IBM, I'm fairly confident that they have a level of security. This goes back to the previous comment of there's a lot of niche players out there. There'll be a lot of small organizations, maybe 4 or 5 people. They created some cool technology and they want to do business, and you may do business with them. They're not going to have a security program in place. They're just going to sign up whatever you tell them, and you go forward, right? So in general and contracting, you want BAA and other contracts in place. They'll willingly sign it because they have no idea what they're signing up for. And then they end up having, whether they're touching your data or managing your data or doing a business process on your behalf, they'll have a breach, right? And so that's where a lot of those supplier ones you've talked about are coming from. On the fire side of the house, this is the consumer side of technology, right? So at the end of the day, your health record is your record, and we have to enable you the ability to get it. And so, there's going to be a lot of apps that are formed that are going to do cool dashboards for diabetes or blood pressure or whatever that you're going to seek out and you're going to accept. And we're going to provide a mechanism for you to pull that data. But you're going to have to understand that you're consenting it to a third-party app. We have no ability to manage the third-party app, and it's at will of the third-party app, right? So there'll be a consent process, just like every time you sign up for a website or put in your credit card information, do you accept the terms and conditions? No one reads it, but if you actually read it, you'll understand why you get bombed with all the telemarketers, because they are selling your information to third parties to market to you directly. So that is an area that I think is evolving, and it will continue to evolve, and that's the area that we got to focus in on.
Great. One last quick question, please.
Actually, I kind of want to just follow up on that, if you don't mind, because I think consent is fascinating. But in the area of machine learning, where you're essentially extracting metadata out of the health records or imagery, right, and then implementing that within a model, especially as you go into like neural nets, if I change my consent, do you take down the algorithm? And if you're using that for diagnostics, then how do you inform me of that? And then what are the third order effects of that? And I think that's kind of what I'm most interested holistically in this forum over the next few days is how do you change algorithms as the law changes?
Well, so
Good question.
first off,
It's
the
like-
majority of these algorithms are primarily logistic regression based, so they use a large statistical sampling for training the model that then is used by the AI for, let's say, Watson oncology or clinical trial matching. And what those therefore are based upon is rigorous experiment sequencing of test with the data, test with the blind data, use the training set, verify you get repeatable outcomes on the 1,000 questions or some other test set. When you subtract a piece of data, perturb the original training set, you have to rerun the test set to verify whether or not you've had a statistical alteration upon the behavior of the AI based upon the subtracted data set or the added data set. Even if it's a small difference, it could small reduction or addition, it could change radically the behavior of a Watson or another AI. Now, Bayesian networks and other types of neural networks that are plugged in under, let's say, old-style AI, they tend to be much more brittle to change and therefore require full reprogramming. The reason why the entire industry got all excited about AI again after what was called the AI winter, when IBM put Watson on Jeopardy, now it feels like ancient history, 2011, but it was a huge thing because we finally had proof of a computer that truly understood the semantics of language well enough to compete with the top 2 players of all time in that thing. Now, if I don't know if you've seen it on YouTube, but if you can go and look it up. And it's actually even instructive for me to go back and look at it periodically and have my jaw hit the floor again to see a computer could actually understand language that well. The reason it could, and the reason why the prior technologies of neural nets and other non-statistical models couldn't do that, is they're too brittle to variation. And so you couldn't ingest all of Wikipedia and all this other stuff from the internet and train a Bayesian network. It just wouldn't scale. It was brittle and wouldn't scale. So to answer your question, depending on the technology that's used, if you're using old-style AI networking, network algorithms, which are classically called rules-based, it can be very unforgiving to that change. If you're using statistical, NLP and ML, then the statistical model, by definition, makes it more forgiving, and you can characterize the alteration. The big care that you have to apply then is understanding the consequence of those changes by looking for discriminatory factors in your test set or non-legal behavior on a equal opportunities or something like that requirements. We had that with one of our earliest Watson pilots. We had to make sure that the algorithm could prove to the government that it was not discriminating against people based upon the inputs. But that's in how you do the test and characterize the test. I hope that is what you were asking.
Steve, Jigar, anything to add?
I mean, I thought what you posed was what happens if you opt out, right? Was that's really...
So for instance,
yeah.
like 23andMe, you give them all of your DNA, and then you're like, hey, we build this great algorithm, right, that we can detect some sort of...
So that's the challenge in
Yeah.
the GDPR right now, right?
Yeah.
So in the US, that's the one-time consent is typically allowed,
Yeah.
and most people in the US don't opt out, right?
Right.
In EU with the GDPR, you have to have a way to opt out. So within GDPR, you can use, I would say, two carve-outs. You can give the data back, which could adversely impact the study that you're doing or the research that you're doing, or you could leverage the carve-out of, public good medical purposes, and try to use that as the approach, not to re-consent. Because in the GDPR, for every phase or every change in what you do, you have to provide additional consent.
And that's on the research side, but think about you're opted in for healthcare operations, delivery of care. What happens if that algorithm changes? That's where you really are going. What happens to my outcome?
Yeah.
And so that's a big issue. And I think there's, I got to believe there's a way to mitigate through that. But again, that's coming. It's great. It's a great question.
That's a lawyer question.
Yeah, right. It's a lawyer, but it's an execution, doctor question too.
Yeah.
But
It's a physician question.
But maybe I was getting a little too geeky in my answer, but it does end up being that all current AI is focusing on statistical machine learning. And therefore, when you remove consent to your information from a particular AI,
Everything changes.
then the change is characterized by the acceptance test set. Earlier I mentioned GXP as a requirement for medical devices, like what we're doing with oncology. So we have to verify that when we change, even remove your information from the stuff that Watson knows, that it still behaves the same way at the end. Or if it changed, here's the delta change, and it needs to be in the test set, and that's part of the FDA quality rigor of testing the system. Now, managing when you do that is the timing issue. Because if you can remove your consent right now and it's a GXP system and somebody tells me I need to regression test it again for 12 months before I can now put out the new change, that's a challenge in front of us.
Well, so let me, on behalf of the audience, thank you all. Fascinating discussion, covered a lot of topics here, give us a lot of thought, things to think about as we go through the next couple of days here. So please, big round of applause for our panel. Thank you all.
Well, thank you.
Great. Oh, a little stiff.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you. Yeah, good stuff.